what is insulin resistance? But to understand insulin resistance, we first must understand how does normal insulin function actually work. Now, imagine that you ate a plain glucose pill, pure glucose, you swallow it, it goes into your small intestines, and immediately it's all absorbed, it's glucose, and it goes and contributes to your blood glucose levels. Nothing has to happen to it. It doesn't have to be metabolized in any way, shape, or form, which would take a bit more time for it to then be absorbed and go into the bloodstream and stuff like that. Immediately it's in the bloodstream. Your blood sugar has a massive spike. And when this high blood glucose goes through your brain, your blood glows through your brain will detect the fact that your blood glucose is higher than what it should be, and your brain will then send some sort of nerve impulse, some nerve signal to an organ known as your pancreas, which is slotted around here. If you can kind of see, it's around there below your rib cage. It's slotted just below your stomach, and the pancreas produces these two hormones known as insulin and glucagon. Now, insulin is the hormone that we're focusing on in this video, hence why the title is something to do with insulin resistance. But when blood sugar levels are higher than what they are normally supposed to be, insulin is released from the pancreas, released into the bloodstream, and then if you imagine the sort of whole blood system, the system of arteries, veins, and capillaries, it is so fast. Your bloodstream goes through and passes by a lot of the cells inside of your body, and on all of these cells that are adjacent to the cells on the capillaries, to your the walls of your actual veins, your arteries, etc. The insulin acts on the walls of these loads and loads of cells. The insulin will act on these walls because the walls of these cells will have little protein receptors, insulin receptors, where the insulin can perfectly bind into that substrate active site shape. Insulin being the substrate will perfectly bind into the protein's active site, and that will stimulate a few things to happen, and this will mean that glucose that is also inside of the bloodstream at the same time can be uptaken into the cells, where it will then go through glycolysis. It will be broken down into energy, acetyl-CoA, all that sort of stuff, ATP that I've talked about in so many other videos. But the problem is that when you have insulin resistance, the cells just stop responding to insulin all that much, and this is essentially how diabetes actually works. Type 2 diabetes is where your cells do not respond to insulin as well as they should do. Type 1 diabetes is where your pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin due to genetic reasons. Diabetes type 1 is normally the genetic one. Diabetes type 2 is due to lifestyle factors like eating too much sugar, too much processed food, processed junk, that contributes to these constant blood sugar spikes that keep on happening when you're eating too much processed junk and sugar. And I'll mention this in a little bit, but I'll go through how these constant sugar spikes can actually contribute to insulin resistance later down the line. But how on earth does insulin, the substrate, bind to the protein receptors, the insulin receptors, active site, actually mean that glucose can be uptaken into cells? And this is due to a process known as autophosphorylation. When insulin binds to the protein insulin receptor, the receptor itself will autophosphorylize, and this will create phosphorylated IRS proteins. These phosphorylated IRS proteins create P13K, and this will activate a molecule with a very long name known as phosphatidylinositol triphosphate. And this molecule with a very long name that I'm not going to repeat activates protein kinase B. Protein kinase B is an enzyme. Kinase, mentioned what a kinase actually does to the body before, transfers phosphate groups from one place to another. And what protein kinase B will do is it will phosphorylate another molecule known as AS160, and this will release things known as GLUT4 transporters to actually go to the cell membrane, diffuse the cell membrane, and uptake glucose. If you imagine the AS160 cells, they're holding on to these GLUT4 transporters, then the phosphorylation from the protein kinase B almost punches their back in a way, and so they forget about the fact that they're holding these GLUT4 transporters. These GLUT4 transporters, which are being held inside of the vesicles of the cell, they are then released. There's a high concentration in this pit that was being held, so they all diffuse outwards towards the cell membranes, and this means that it can uptake the glucose normally. Problem is that somewhere down the line, this process gets screwed with because of continuous high glucose spikes and more stuff that I'll talk about in a bit. But an easy way for you to imagine what is going wrong inside of this process that means glucose can be uptaken into cells for energy is imagine that you were having 100 glucose pills a day at regular intervals. The constant glucose spikes, insulin constantly being released from the pancreas to make sure glucose is uptaken into cells. You can almost imagine there's going to be some kind of clear general desensitization in this such a short, narrow space of time from probably just the receptor on the wall of the cell to the actual insulin. But but when you have this high amount of glucose constantly being circulated around the body, you will get something known as hyperinsulinemia, where the constant insulin that's being released, it's not excreted and broken down or binding to the receptor quickly enough that it can actually sort of get out of the bloodstream and the insulin can return to its normal and proper concentration inside of the blood. Hyperinsulinemia is a big sort of marker of the conversion of glucose to fat happening inside of cells. When glucose is uptaken into cells, it'll be broken down by glycolysis into pyruvate. Pyruvate can turn into acetyl-CoA, and while acetyl-CoA can also be broken down to produce energy, if your body doesn't need that energy because you are sedentary, you are not doing any exercise at all, that acetyl-CoA is often made and transferred into fatty acid synthesis, which is almost like the opposite of beta oxidation in a way, and that will create fatty acids. The problem is that when too many fatty acids are created, this is going to create some adipose tissue, excessive amounts of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue contains inflammatory substances known as adipokines and cytokines, and these inflammatory substances are very, very bad for the sort of insulin cell receptor processes. It will phosphorylate molecules inside of the active site of the protein receptor, insulin receptor that is on the wall. There will be loads and loads of amino acids inside of the long chain of protein that is on side of the wall of the cell. It will phosphorylate a specific type of protein in this long amino acid chain polypeptide known as serine that will screw with the shape of the active site, and this will mean that insulin is less able to actually bind to the receptor in the first place, meaning the whole process just doesn't happen, and AS1560, I think it was, will just like sort of stay there holding the GLUT4 in the vesicles, not being released whatsoever because it's not being phosphorylated by protein kinase B, because that's never ever being created or activated, because the first step in the process is the one that's being screwed with in this specific thing. But the problem is that insulin resistance is such a vicious cycle, because that means that glucose is not being absorbed as much. It's going to end up fatty acid synthesis. So that is how you sort of get the visceral fat buildup on the inside of your organs. That's often what this causes. Sugar being turned into fat, the adipose tissue. This adipose tissue is not the sort of stomach fat that you see there. It's the bit that's inside, it's under your abdominal muscles. Imagine your abs, your six-pack, etc. It's the fat that's actually underneath those muscles. That's the adipose tissue. That is known as visceral fat. That is what is releasing the inflammatory substances. And while this outer fat will also do that exact same thing, it's less potent because it can't reach the bloodstream as well as the visceral fat that is literally right next to your organs, right next to your main arteries and stuff. So this visceral fat is a lot more dangerous, a lot more potent, because it can also sort of restrict the movement and the sort of breathability of your organs in a weird sort of way. And yeah, that's just not good news in general. So visceral fat, bad news. Excessive amount of sugar and insulin is often what causes the promotion of sugar to fat, because your body simply cannot handle the amount of glucose that's in your bloodstream. When you have the 100 pills or so of glucose circulating around your blood, of course, so much insulin is going to be released. If you do this every single day, it's going to be desensitized because of the amount of fat that's had to be created, because there is just too much glucose. And then when your insulin cells don't respond, you're going to get hyperglycemia, which is going to be too much glucose inside of the bloodstream. And then the exact same thing happens again. Glucose turns into fat. It's just a vicious cycle of there being too much sugar inside of your bloodstream. Your body doesn't know what to do with it at all, so it just turns it into visceral fat because it's the easiest thing that it can do. And visceral fat is often made up of saturated fatty acids. Not trying to demonize saturated fatty acids here, because saturated fatty acids are not a bad thing at all. Often, in places where saturated fatty acids are found, is inside of things like dairy products, things like cheese, milk, and butter, and oils. The problem is that these things also contain a lot of nutritious things because they're food. Butter contains a load of antioxidants. Things like oils and stuff contain so many different vitamins and minerals. Dairy products are great sources of a lot of vitamins and minerals as well. So saturated fatty acids have been demonized quite a lot in society, and we therefore avoid these potentially good products. Problem is that saturated fatty acids are the easiest type of fatty acid to make inside of the body. So visceral fat is mostly made up of saturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids, while they are not like an awful heinous thing at all, they do raise both HDL and LDL cholesterol levels because it contributes to a few processes which I talk about in many other videos. It raises both of these. LDL cholesterol is the bad lipoprotein cholesterol, and so when this rises, you're more likely to suffer from things like atherosclerosis, things like the clogging of your arteries and stuff like that. Not good news whatsoever. It is sugar that does in the end contribute to the visceral fat buildup, to the atherosclerosis, because it makes loads and loads of saturated fatty acids that make the LDL, as well as making HDL. Honestly, if you do genuine exercise, if you do regular exercise, if you eat healthily to a pretty good extent, you don't eat a lot of sugar, saturated fatty acids are honestly nothing to worry about in the majority of people. There are probably a few certain medical conditions where that's not the case, and I'm not educated enough to sort of tell people about that. But for the majority of people, saturated fatty acids are not going to be an issue for your heart whatsoever, because it will still break those saturated fatty acids down into acetyl-CoA. It won't stay there and be made into fat tissue unless you eat a very excessive amount, which is what people more so do of sugar than fats anyway. So it's more the sugar that you want to worry about, because that sugar will be converted into saturated fatty acids. That's the way that you should be worried about getting saturated fatty acids, because that will go into visceral fat, not the sort of external fat that saturated fatty acids from your diet would go to anyway. So yeah, just don't worry too much about saturated fatty acids from your diet, because the foods that they're contained with often contain a lot of nutrients, unless it's processed junk, etc. But I'm sure, hopefully, you can kind of make those normal conscious decisions whether to eat fast food and junk food constantly anyway. But with that, I hope you now understand the mechanisms of insulin resistance, how insulin and blood sugar is actually controlled inside of the body. And yeah, with that, I recommend subscribing, because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have. And good luck.